Welcome to Chapter 4. We're going to be talking about how we classify and name crops on a worldwide basis. So here we go. Okay, so Chapter 4, a little bit of an outline for you. We're going to look at agronomic crop categories. We'll look at what the difference is between medicinal and psychoactive crops, toxic plants. We'll look at a lot of the nutritional uses and categories of those uses with crops, bioenergy, which is obviously very important in this day and age, and then how we name those crops as well. At how we classify different crops with 4 different categories. We look at the classification, how it's used agronomically, how it's used in its nutritional value, the life cycle, and then the adaptation. So adaptation of that plant. So that's broken down into those 4 categories. And then after that is then decided and deciphered, we then look at the binomial nomenclature. So the genus and the species, which is a 2-part name. And we do all of that in a taxonomy system, plant-like system, and how we organize those plants. So we're looking at the genus, we're looking at the species. We'll look at how we're able to utilize this crop in different areas of the world. What if this crop is high in a lot of vitamins, if it's low in a lot of vitamins, if it's high in different nutrients, if it's low in different nutrients. So that's kind of what we'll be talking about today. And specifically, we'll look at some pretty intense categories of crops and how they are classified. Categories that we'll talk about throughout this chapter and you'll read about, and we'll look at in the crop of the week as well. So some of these might look familiar to you, some of them might not. So if you've had any sort of background in farming or ranching, I'm sure you know what a cover crop is, but we'll go into that a little bit more. So cover crops, forages, pulses, grain crops, recreational turf crops, green manure crops, which is very important. This is all based on agronomic uses, nutritional value, how it's adapted, and then the life cycle, of that plant. I want you to know about a cereal crop. A cereal crop is really a grass that we produce and we grow for the grain, for the edible grain. So a really good example of that might be wheat, because we're going to grow wheat to make different types of edible foods for consumers. And one of the probably most common that you've heard of is cereal, like what you eat at breakfast. So it can be defined as a processed breakfast food, and then obviously you add milk to that. But some other ones that you might not realize are cereal crops. There's corn is in some cases considered a cereal crop if you make different foods out of that corn. Barley, sorghum's really important. Rice are really important to cereal crops. Why do we look at that? Why is it a grass? Because it's going to store the energy as a starch. So when you're looking at wheat, rice, corn, barley, sorghum, those are all plants that are known for their starch and are easily made into processed foods like cereal. So this is not a grass. So it's not a cereal crop because we're looking at the plant where the seed is harvested. So we could look at soybeans. In some cases, we can look at corn, field beans, flax, wheat, in some cases, barley, rye. And I'm sure some of you are going to be asking me, well, why can wheat and corn be a grain crop and a cereal crop? It's because we're using it for different foods and different ways of feeding different types of livestock and humans. And we'll talk more about that in class this week. And then small grains, which wheat is considered wheat, oat, barley, rye, those are all considered small grains. So we're growing them in different ways for different people and or livestock. Okay, pulses. These are legumes, okay, legumes that we grow because they have a really high protein seed. So this is very important with a lot of developing countries because they can grow legumes or pulses because they want that protein. So really common one that we see in developing countries and developed countries. It's easier for us to grow in America is a soybean. And it's really cool because it has a very, very high protein seed that we've learned to make many, 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 many different products from. So that's pretty neat. The pulses, all, however, must be processed before they're edible. So they have to go through a processing some sort of processing way for them to be edible and then digested by humans. Peanuts are also a good one. Chickpeas, they're very, very high in protein. Field peas, edible field beans, lentils, those are all pulses, and they're grown. They're legumes grown for their high protein seed. For livestock, forages is a vegetation that's grown and used to feed livestock, and we'll get into a little bit of more of how those forages are used in grazing systems and all that in a little bit. But we use this for animals like anywhere from goats, horses, cattle. It's kind of getting pretty big in the hog world now, and sheep, obviously. So a lot of these livestock species are able to utilize forages on many different aspects of how they're being grown. So this is from a pasture, and they're harvested. It's harvested from grazing and harvested, obviously, forage. So forages can be stored as hay, and so in the summertime, those farmers and ranchers are trying to put up hay and hopefully get a couple cuttings off of it, or they'll store it as silage, and so they'll be mixing a lot of different things into one and utilizing that as silage. So we'll look at wet silage versus dry silage and corn silage versus hay silage. We'll look at all of those, but those are all different ways of feeding livestock in terms of forage. And this is going to be an example would be cotton. That's probably the most familiar and common fiber crop, because we're able to use cotton to make a lot of different things like clothing, baskets, rope, paper. Cotton's used in a lot of, pretty much a lot of aspects of our lives, and it's grown in a lot of places in the world. So we utilize cotton is the most widely used fiber crop in the world as well. So fiber crops are those plants that are harvested to get that fiber that can be used to make different types of items like clothing, cardboard, stuff like that we're able to use on a day-to-day basis. Root and tuber crops. These are our potatoes, our artichokes. These are crops that are grown for their starch-rich and underground storage organs. So when you're looking at, for example, a potato crop, those are grown obviously underground. It's kind of like that root, and we'll talk about this in class this week. But that root is the root and tuber of the plant. Now, how does it photosynthesize? Well, if you've ever grown potatoes, you know that the potato actually has a foliage that grows on top of the soil, then able to photosynthesize, then able to grow that potato as large as you want it. So we'll look at that a little bit more in class this week. But a root and tuber crop are those crops that are grown for their really starch-rich storage organ, okay, like a potato, and they're also grown underground. So they're kind of like the root, if you will. The whole big point to me as a farmer is the prevention of soil erosion in many different aspects of the way we grow different crops. So one really big reason why my husband and I grow wheat is to have a cover crop on a field that might have a little bit of erosion ability. So whether that's by wind, whether that's by rain, however that might be, that's a really cool cover crop to use, and it's not as pricey as a lot of other cover crops as well. Hairy vetch is a really good one. Winter rye is a really good one. We look at, in northern areas, we look at cover crops, obviously to protect the soil from snow and from ice, and we get a little bit of that down here, but not as much. So cover crops are really important. Main thing is to just conserve that soil, especially that O layer and A layer in our fields. Companion crops, these are pretty cool. That there's a picture there of an oat companion crop with growing with alfalfa. And this is pretty neat because that farmer will sometimes they'll be able to harvest it differently or harvest it at the same time. We look at companion crops to provide a lot of erosion control. This really suppresses weeds and in some cases can give you some income, which is pretty good. So wheat or oats are planted with the companion crop of alfalfa, which is pretty neat. And we're actually able to buy that seed pretty cheap, and it's pretty valuable, in terms of not having to buy herbicide, not having to fertilize, because a lot of that the wheat or the oats are able to put a lot more nutrients back into the soil. Different manures, and I'm talking about vegetative manure. So we incorporate this while that vegetative or that plant is still growing. And so we look like sweet clover is a good one, alfalfa is a good one, winter rye. And so green manure crops, what you're going to do is plant a cheap hay grazer or cheap hairy veg or something like that. And right before it matures, right before it dies, you're going to plow it under the soil and it will start to decompose and disintegrate into the soil. And you're just adding organic matter. That's what you're doing. You're adding organic matter, which is awesome. And you're able to do that with very, very little money, which is something that a lot of farmers and ranchers do a lot to make sure that happens. So they're getting that extra quality of organic matter. Recreational turf crops. So before the days of fake turf and all these NFL teams, spending way too much money on fake turf, there was turf crops. So like perennial grasses, this is still used in golf courses. So Kentucky bluegrass, that's a pretty familiar and common grass for golf courses, could be used for sports lawns like soccer fields. Anything that doesn't have a fake turf would be considered a recreational turf crop. Now this is a Bermuda grass golf green, and this has to be managed pretty intensely just because it grows very, very quick and it has to be watered almost daily. And so that's really important with recreational turf crops. You have to make sure that you're utilizing it, but you're taking care of it, on a daily basis. Types of bioenergy crops. We have biomass and then biofuel. So really important to know the difference between the two. Biomass, those are just crops that are burned, okay, so burned to produce heat and electricity, all right? Biofuels are grown just for their liquid fuel, so specifically for their liquid fuel. So this is going to help us be more, have more renewable resources than we do today. And this is something that has skyrocketed in the last really 15 to 20 years. Back, 15 years ago when people started talking about ethanol and how ethanol is going to be the new, renewable energy source, that was awesome. And it was for about 10 years. And then we have all of these different types of biomass and biofuels that, that competition has gotten pretty big, but ethanol is still pretty much on top of that.